It's here on Earth Day, 51st anniversary of Earth Day. My name is Jordan Howell. I'm an associate professor of sustainable business here at Rowan. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Responsible Leadership, along with Dr. Susanna Santos, who's also here with us this morning. Today, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Geoffrey Jones, who's the Isidore Straus Professor of Business History and the faculty chair of the Business History Initiative at Harvard University. Dr. Jones holds degrees of BA, MA, and PhD from Cambridge University in the UK. He has an honorary doctorate in economics and business administration from the Copenhagen Business School and an honorary PhD from the University of Helsinki in Finland. He taught previously at the London School of Economics, Cambridge and Reading Universities in the UK, and at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. He's held visiting professorships at Gakuin University, Tokyo, Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and is an affiliate professor of Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. Elsewhere at Harvard, he serves on the executive committee of the Harvard Center for African Studies, the faculty committee of the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, and on the policy committee of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Dr. Jones has authored scores of research articles and authored and edited more than 30 books, including Varieties of Green Business, Industries, Nations, and Time, and Profits and Sustainability, A History of Green Entrepreneurship. His talk today is titled, In Search of a Responsible Business, Can History Help? For our audience members, please do post your questions and comments in the chat area, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss these at the end of Dr. Jones's talk. And now over to Dr. Geoffrey Jones, if you are ready.
I am ready.
All right.
Thank you very much for coming to hear yet another Zoom talk. I just would like to.
Looks good. We see some PowerPoint. Yep.
Yeah, is that good?
Yep.
All right. So I guess these days we hear all the time about the need for business to be responsible. And I guess that kind of begs the question, what is responsible business? So as I was thinking about this talk, I quickly got into my head a list of like irresponsible businesses. Businesses that facilitate climate, made the climate situation even worse. Tech companies that didn't think about responsibility of their technologies. Tobacco companies have all got our favorite lists. But what exactly, conversely, is a responsible company? It seems one of those things you can define the negative of much more than you can define the positive. And indeed, the question arises whether that can actually be such thing as a responsible company. So I looked at my bookshelves, books I recommend to students, and these very well-known books are all telling us one tale, and the tale is that capitalism as a system is irresponsible. And as a result, it makes no sense to talk about a responsible business. So, as usual, as a business historian, I wanted to look back in history to see if I can get some sort of clarity of thought about all this. And the first thing that strikes you is that we are not the first generation that feels it's in crisis and feels that business is playing a big part in that crisis and needs to step up. Came across this speech by the Dean of Harvard Business School in 1927. It's a speech when they opened the new campus, where I'm still sitting at this very moment. Look what he's saying. Unless more of our business leaders learn to exercise their powers and responsibilities with a definitely increased sense of responsibility towards other groups in the community, our civilization may well head for one of its periods of decline. He said that in 1927 in front of like 5,000 people. They were very rich people because at this stage, US was going through a giant economic boom. And the top 1% had the same share of that wealth as they do at the present moment. So it's a very odd statement to say at that time. And of course, he was completely right. Within 2 years, you got the Wall Street crash. We've got a horrible decade of depression. Within 5 years, you've got the Nazis in Germany. Civilization did actually go into one of its periodic periods of decline. But what was Donham thinking about when he said an increased responsibility? I tell you what he can't have been thinking about. He can't have been thinking about a little bit more corporate social responsibility. He cannot have been thinking about a little bit more philanthropy. He's thinking about a kind of responsibility which saves civilization. I want to call this, for this talk, deep responsibility. I don't know, I can call it anything, but I just want to use that phrase at the moment, deep responsibility, to separate it out from, say, like more conventional corporate social responsibility. It wasn't just talk, by the way. At the business school, he tried to transform the nature of business education. I'm sorry about the gender comments. As soon as he took over, he wanted every MBA student to be taught the relation of businessmen, we would say business people, of course, to society. He annoyed everybody here by hiring labor leaders to teach students, introducing ethics courses, teaching history. He teamed up with a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, the founder of process philosophy, if you know about that. He met every week, and they wanted to make philosophy at the core of business education. He's thinking he needs a different type of business leader. So with that in mind, I went in search of deep responsibility over really the last few years. I'm not looking for heroes. I'm not looking for perfect people. I'm looking for actually examples of what a deeply responsible business would look like. Because I've got tons of examples of what a bad business looks like. So what are these? What would deeply responsible business actually look like? So I've been doing research on all of these characters and more. I've only got 30 minutes, so I'm not going to take 30 hours to go through all of those. Let me tell you 4 stories and then some generalizations, maybe that we can make about deeply responsible businesses. And I'm going in order of their birth dates, actually, if you wondered. Edward Filene. There's a picture of him. He and his brother built one of the most successful retailing businesses in the United States. He is very upset by the way that power and wealth is increasingly not evenly distributed in the United States. And everything he does is designed to address that problem. In his business, he aimed to sell goods at ever lower prices while paying his own employees ever higher wages, higher than the industry norm. He did all the welfare schemes that other retail giants did at the same time, actually, but went further, including recruiting unionized workers. That wasn't good enough for him. He recognized that the ownership was a problem. And so in 1913, he started a scheme to give away all the family shares to employees by 1928. It didn't work, and he ends up getting kicked out of his own firm. And it's partly his own problem because his personality and everything else was a bit of an issue. But his goal was completely clear. And that's not the only thing he does. From early on, he starts to use his reputation, his networks, his finances to campaign against corruption in the city of Boston, of which there was much. He was involved in a massive urban renewal campaign. And then most importantly, from the 1920s, he is the person who pushes the credit union movement in the United States. And credit unions, he saw, were absolutely key to letting marginal people, poor people, access finance rather than go to banks or worse, money lenders. Then, with what money he's got, he establishes a philanthropy, which finances all manner of progressive causes. And just before he dies, he launches an attack on fake news, or propaganda as it was called at the time, because he believed that a democracy could never function if news was not true. Everything he does then is about addressing what he saw as the problem of inequality of power and wealth. Let me move to a second person, Annie Turbo Malone. She is actually America's first self-made female millionaire. She builds a black hair pet care business. The opportunity was that the mainstream beauty industry was entirely racist and so would have no interest at all in African American skin or hair. Now, as like all my characters, there's an element of, elements of some issues around her. She's partly selling hair straightening products, which people didn't like at the time and certainly don't like criticize now. On the other hand, as a closer look at what she's doing, it's not really about hair straightening, it's about hygiene. She was extremely concerned in her that African Americans had poor access to, they were not able to keep their hair in a way that stopped hair loss and all sorts of other things. And so she spent forever thinking about ways to improve their hygiene. And she is, at a time when there's still horrible lynching, when there's terrible discrimination, she is a positive assertion of the beauty of Black people and of women's right to choose, and a huge affirmer of African identity and its worth. You can see where her brand Poro comes from West Africa. And all the time she's talking about promotion, using her business to help the African American community rise. The most important thing that she does is open a school to train Black hairdressers. And what she does is give up to 75,000 people the opportunity to be a hairdresser instead of what they would have been, a washerwoman or a maid. Again, another large donator of to all manner of African American charities. Let me go to my next guy, Esterbay Labai, Indian guy born in British India. Sets up another successful textile business. It's still there, biggest denim company in India. He's a Jain. Everything he does in his business reflects Jain values of truth, of honesty, of the highest ethical standards, and of avoiding industries that he considered did harm. After India becomes independent, he joins with the government to build a chemical industry because he thought a new state needed its own chemical industry. But how does he do it? He chooses to take a difficult course and build the plant in a rural area with high degrees of unemployment. Then he turns it into this beautiful landscaped place with trees and everything else out of concerns for the environment, without concern for how people would work. But that's not all. Unlike most of the Indian business community, he worked with, embraced publicly Gandhi, campaigning against the British, something extremely risky to do. He believed it as his responsibility to strive for national independence. And that's not all. He looked at his city and he wanted a city where there was education, a lot of education. And he spends 30 years building schools, building universities, building science institutes, building other cultural facilities to make his city a vibrant place. Let me end with my fourth guy, Egyptian this time, Abulaj Ibrahim. Egyptian, but spent long years in Switzerland, came back in 1977 from Switzerland because he was very shocked by the poverty he saw in Egypt. And his vision is to build a organic or biodynamic farm in the desert. And he proceeds to do that. He gets a ton of desert, pure desert, and using biodynamic methods, he creates a giant organic area. Those organic products he sells into Europe at premium prices and then pours the money back into creating a school system, a cultural system, and eventually a university, the Galapagos University for Sustainable Development. So what do we learn from these stories about what a responsible business leader is and whatever? Well, let me begin with the most simplistic observation. I think regarding capitalism as a homogeneous force for badness is definitely very simplistic. What we see in the history of capitalism is like regular companies coexisting with these highly responsible companies, coexisting with deeply horrible companies. So you have like these three different types. Historically, all the deeply responsible companies I find were closely held or family owned. I can't find a public company that I would regard as deeply responsible. And oddly, although I've given you four people in completely different contexts, and all my guys are in different contexts, they share some similar characteristics. Let me tell you what I think they are. I think they all held a set of values. These our values can be called, well, there are two aspects of them. One I call ethics, and I think although ethics varies in different situations, honesty and transparency are constants. These people all held a high degree of ethics. Secondly, they all held a high degree of spirituality. I do not mean formal religious belief by that, although many of my characters are religious or were religious. Others are influenced by philosophy. Some are influenced entirely not by an outside system, but by themselves. And so I follow other writers in defining spirituality as a belief in the interconnectedness of all living things. Spiritual values are key, I believe, to deep responsibility, because first of all, it keeps you genuine. Secondly, it reduces fear of the unknown, and deep responsibility involves taking a lot of risks. And thirdly, and even more crucially, spirituality enables you to take a holistic view of situations. You cannot dismiss bad things as externalities if you believe everything is connected. Values, I think, shape practices, and there are three practices that I think are important for responsible businesses. First, choice of industry. I do not believe you can be a responsible business if you're in a rotten industry. It's just nonsense. I put tobacco up there. I could give you a list of other industries. You cannot be responsible. Choice of industry is very important. Our people that I've looked at all chose industries with a purpose, whether it's to promote hygiene, whether it's to build a new nation, whether it's to reduce poverty. The miserable guy up there, George Cadbury, this British guy, went into chocolate. He went into chocolate because as a Quaker, he wouldn't have anything to do with war, and he was looking for something alternative to alcohol. Now, we have some more marginal cases where the industries are not wicked, but not necessarily a great idea. I give an example of Ben & Jerry of ice cream, or Yvon Chouinard, Patagonia and clothing. I could think of better industries for them to be in, but what they do is choose to make everything they then do in those industries ethical. Choice of values shape choice of industry. Choice of industry is very important. I think relations of recognition of stakeholders is very important. Stakeholder capitalism, we all know, is an important aspect of responsibility. And I would stress that they need to be, the relations with other shared stakeholders need to be respectful and humble. This starts with treating employees with great respect and great humility, and that's true of all the people we've been looking at. I think it also involves a recognition that massive societal change must always involve working with governments. It cannot be accomplished by a single firm or group of firms, and arguably it shouldn't be accomplished because massive social change requires democratic legitimacy. And again, all the people I've been looking at work with governments. They don't lobby in the sense that we see too often in the United States, but they do advocate. This British guy again, George Cadbury, advocated for state old age pensions, big time, for years in Britain. There was no advantage in his business for that. And you can go through these other guys, they were advocates. And I think the third thing that deeply responsible business leaders do is sustain communities. Here I was reminded of Ragam Raj's recent book, The Third Pillar, which talks about nations, markets, and communities as the three pillars on which society rests, and how community has been extremely damaged in the last 2 decades, era of globalization. All of my guys and women invested in building communities, real-time physical communities. Cadbury built this garden village around his chocolate factory. It's a picture of it up there with a sort of quainty British-looking things. Recently voted the best place to live in Britain, as a matter of fact. All of them. I give another example of Anne Wang, who was for a time almost the biggest computer manufacturer in the United States. He took the choice not to outsource as everybody else was doing, but instead he invested in the city of Lowell, which is a mill town in a terrible state in Massachusetts. And he built a computer plant in Chinatown in Boston, which was also in a terrible condition, to provide decent jobs for people. Responsible business leaders build communities. So why isn't it had become the norm? If there were all these responsible businesses, why did it never spread beyond these sort of cases? I thought about this a lot, and I think I have a number of answers. First of all, responsible businesses are always at a disadvantage to less responsible businesses. I never believe in win-win solutions. I think it's one of the fallacies of sustainable literature that there are win-win solutions, unfortunately. Sustainability, like responsibility, is costly. If it wasn't, if there were win-win solutions, capitalist system would have all gone towards sustainability and responsibility, for sure. These experiments were highly vulnerable to the founder dying or retiring. If a company went public, it was finished. That's why the most sustainable companies you can find, say, in India, in family-held groups, where values are transferred across generations. And then, as Dean Donovan of Harvard Business School found out, values, which are so important, are extremely hard to teach. You cannot teach them at business schools. You cannot do it. By the time anybody, the students I teach are 25 to 29, they've got their values already. That's difficult. Changing the next generation of managers, the story's done by the time they get to a management school. And deeply responsibility has got a lot worse since the 1980s. I think it's a lot more difficult. I think it's got difficult in particular by the spread of the rhetoric of responsibility and sustainability. We live in an age of total fake news regarding sustainability and responsibility now. And it's very difficult to be truly responsible in this world. So let me end with some thoughts about if individual business leaders can never shift the whole system, can we get a responsible system for these things too? And how should that system be based? Should it be based on values or should it be based on institutions? So I want to end by looking at two attempted system reforms, one of which dates 100 years ago, is still with us, one of which is a more recent one. The one that's still with us is the system of thought anthroposophy associated with the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner. Steiner is technically called an esoteric thinker. People at the time, and most people now, consider him a complete lunatic. But if we put aside various qualifications in the interest of time, he had a fundamental view that humanity was in a giant struggle against materialism and had lost it. And somehow we had to restore a more holistic view of human beings. For him, a uniting of the body, the soul, and the spirit, and a uniting of the planet, humanity with the planet, with the cosmos. So everything he did was about promoting this sort of holistic view of the world. And that's why he's become extremely important 50 years after his death in the Green Movement. The other thing about Steiner is he may have been a philosopher, but he wanted his ideas to be put into practice. And that's what he proceeded to do. He started the Waldorf school system, which is now spread widely around the world, which teaches a highly creative and holistic view of education. He created the first really organized system of organic farming, biodynamic farming, and his followers created Demeter, the first organic certificate in 1928, 50 years before we had any other one. And he's the first philosopher to set up his own company, which is now called Veleda. And since the 70s, there's been more and more of his companies founded by his ideas in banking and in other industries. And some of these are very substantial companies now. And they act as a system with transfers of knowledge and capital between them. It's a self-sustaining system in which sustainability and responsibility is at the very core of what they do. And the Egyptian guy that I showed, Ibrahim Aboulish, he's one of these people. You make money not to make money, but to put it back into community, into education, and into culture. That said, this is a very niche system, and it's based on a set of ideas which are not scalable. Most people are not going to buy into some of these fundamental ideas, I think. So let me finish with the B corporations. I think everybody here probably knows about B corporations, so I didn't say much, except there's a lot of hope put on them. Chris Marquez's new book, Better Business, has talked about them as the most important social movement you've never heard of. And it's a great idea, really, to institutionalize stakeholder capitalism by mandating financial society and environmental performance as equal. So I think it's a very promising thing. Unfortunately, it's also had, I think, surprisingly poor traction, and it's remained almost entirely confined to small companies. And it has no sort of like evangelical element. The companies that have become B co-ops have mostly already been social entrepreneurs. And they just get there, they make the good easy by giving them a certification. I hold much more promise in what's happened beginning in Latin America. So 2012, 4 Latin American people traveled up to the United States and asked if they could take the B Corp idea down to Latin America. There's a couple of examples of them there. And they formed Sistema B. They called it Sistema B, not because they actually wanted not just to focus on changing firms' statutes, but to change the whole system. So from the very beginning, their aim has been to address, to proletize all stakeholders, consumers, academics, and policymakers. They've set up an academy to provide teaching and research schools, to spread news among academics of B corporations. They engage with governments. The guy in the picture, Juan Pablo Loranes, told me last week that it was absolutely essential that policymakers are involved in this process, that companies alone will never be able to shift the needle. And they've created a real theory of change which recognizes the holistic nature of the problem and the holistic requirement to solve it. As I put in the PowerPoint, they seek to change how business behaves, the rules of the game, that means getting at governments, and how people expect business and society to behave. Can history help then? Well, you probably conclude after that, probably not. I think there's some good news from looking at history. It's not some sort of fantasy that business can be really deeply responsible. There are examples. I've only given you a few of them. Wonderful examples that have transformed people's lives, lots of people's lives. The bad news, of course, is that they haven't mainstreamed. And the bad news, I think, money and responsibility are really, really, really difficult to mix well. So I think something like Systema B, and it's got precedence historically, is the most productive way to go. Associations with firms, responsibility institutes, working with all stakeholders to change the rules of the game. I think there's no chance that large public companies will become responsible in a meaningful sense of their own volition. So there I would also agree with the Systema B people and other people that governments need to intervene and change rules of game to really prevent the kind of gross irresponsibility that we've seen too much of in the last 30 years. Thank you very much for your patience.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jones. Very interesting and kind of, dare I say, controversial in some ways. We'd all like to feel nice about the possibilities for business on Earth Day, but clearly it's much more complicated than that. If folks out there, if you have questions or comments, please post them into the chat area and I'll do my best to moderate them. I was thinking of some questions during your talk, Geoff, and I was wondering if you had any perspectives on kind of the current situation in the US. You know, we've seen in the last 2 years and especially the last 12 months, business leaders making statements about the role of business to serve stakeholders as opposed to only shareholders. Is something different about this moment in the US, but maybe more broadly? Are real substantial changes coming our way in the future, do you think?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
You know, firms like BlackRock, you know, they do lots of horrible things, and outside their headquarters in, I know somebody who goes to protest outside their headquarters every day in New York, as a matter of fact. I think there's a perceived legitimacy crisis. There's a perceived, that's one thing. Another thing is there's a perceived source of funds from ESG funding, which is prompting people to be interested in this space. Are there deep changes happening? I don't know. You go through every case, right? And you see, what do you see? Look at Telsa, right? On the one hand, the great hope for responsibility. On the other hand, Bitcoin, right? The most dirty thing you could do to the planet. So I don't think so. I think it's a lot of talk, actually.
Yeah, so a related question that came in, and you addressed this a little bit. What do you see as the role of government and regulation in the development and operation of responsible business? You said there's some sort of advocacy that's happened in your examples, that deeply responsible business leaders have advocated for government action. Are we at a point where government can require some changes to happen? Would that be effective? What's the role for regulation?
No, I think in the, you know, if we're talking about a major societal change and a major move for greater sustainability, there has to be a role for public policy. And as I said, it's partly a question of democracy as well. You know, I think it's very important that changes in the rules of the game are supported by democratic institutions. But you know, currently in the United States, we have a, you know, ridiculous system of allowing tax avoidance by large corporations, and you know, a bunch of other things which, thank heavens, the Biden administration is thinking about. And there, I think you do need a change in the rules of the game. I don't think it can solve all the problems, not at all. But you know, the rules of the game are currently very badly skewed. and need to be unskewed, really. Um, and that's not saying you've got to get some sort of like communist system at all. I mean, if you're thinking, think of successful countries in Europe, like Germany or Scandinavia. They have all sorts of mandates for behavior for more responsible business, and they are able to combine that with successful business systems. So I think moving a little bit in that direction, I think is quite important. I just don't think business alone can or even should solve all of society's problems, but it can be part and should be part of the solution through its ability to innovate um, and be entrepreneurial. Sorry.
No, that's interesting and related from our own Dr. Santos. A question specific to the pandemic and recovering from it. Businesses have become more resilient due to the pandemic, and many leaders and founders have been talking about the importance of returning to values, spirituality, community building, all these things. Do you think that resilient businesses are more likely to become deeply responsible businesses?
Resilient businesses, deeply. Oh, that's a good question. That's got me thinking. What can I say? I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe resilient means they are flexible and open-minded, and that's a pretty good. That's a pretty good start. I'm thinking about, all the things wrong in our society and all the opportunities that business can have to change that society. So yeah, it's more than unflexible, rigid.
Yeah, it seems like many of the examples that you gave were firms that have stood the test of time, or they've been around for decades or longer. So there must be some element of resilience built into them. We have some questions from our faculty about the roles of business school in all of this. Dr. Johnson, one of our faculty members, given Harvard's early experience with integrating values, ethics, and philosophy into the curriculum, what do you see as the role of B schools today?
Well, Harvard, the failure to integrate those into those curriculum, Donham schemes didn't get through.
Yeah.
Most of the faculty opposed what he was trying to do, and then the MBAs wouldn't turn up to the ethics classes, which was another issue. So most of his ideas didn't get through, and I've completely forgotten about now, which is like very sad. What's the role of business schools now? I mean, I think Donham got it right. The role of business schools is to teach responsibility of business and the responsibility of these young people to become more responsible business leaders. Does Harvard Business School do that? No. What we have managed to do is put our first year course. We have something called leadership and corporate accountability. So we ghettoed responsibility in one course. So for 80 minutes, the students can be responsible, and then they go out to the next class on finance and they learn how to cheat on their taxes. And then they go into the marketing class and learn how to market completely responsible products. And I was one of the people who thought that was like a really bad idea at the time. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's an awareness of the problem. Certainly our new dean, his very first thing he said is we've got to start taking business and society serious for once, rather than just talking about it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a long way to go. And there's a long way to go because most faculty don't want to do it, be involved. They're trained in finance or marketing, and that's what they want to do. And a lot of students pay a lot of money to get a degree in order to get rich.
Yeah.
And so thinking about sort of like wider issues isn't top of mind for many of them. Although personally, my own personal experience is that there has been a generation shift
Mm.
in the recent years. Certainly my own classes now are oversubscribed, and it's not because I'm some sort of brilliant teacher. It's because I'm one of the people who that talk about responsibility and all this sort of stuff. I think that's
Sure.
cool. And finance is undersubscribed.
Okay. Yeah, our dean has contributed a follow-up question. She's very active with the AACSB, the accrediting body for business schools, as you know. She says they've issued new accreditation standards that very heavily emphasize societal responsibility, social responsibility, sustainability, all of these things. Do you think that something like an accrediting body for business schools can help move the needle on this issue?
Well, yeah, it would be quite a good idea. I mean, we have to. My only hesitation is that, when I was working on like environmentalism, I looked a lot at certification,
Right.
and certification has become an instrument of like fake news
Yeah.
in many ways. So you have to think a little bit about the content of the accreditation and keep the standards high. I think that's why I like the anthroposophical Demeter standard of organic certification, which keeps the standards extremely high. And I think that's the way to go, because if you let the standards sort of get blurred, so that would be my only thing. But I think, yeah, institutionalizing responsibility,
Mhm.
setting out, signpost guidelines, all of that is incentives is very, very, very important, I think.
Yeah.
And business schools have the same problems as business. Money and responsibility don't mix so well, and so you need to set up some sort of things to sort of help resolve the tension.
Sure. Remove some of the obligation to act independently. If someone tells you you have to follow the standard, then you have to follow it. You don't have to do it on your own, I guess. One question specific about environment, since you brought it up. We've got here Donna Haraway famously commented that she couldn't imagine life on Earth at this point without capitalism. So here we are with capitalist economies omnipresent around the world. Are we doomed to environmental catastrophe given the inherent characteristics of capitalism, or is green capitalism possible? That's a big
Well,
question.
there's a big, and I've given some examples. I could give more of deeply green businesses. Most of the green technologies that we have now, as I wrote about in my previous book, were developed by small entrepreneurs, visionary entrepreneurs who believed in wind power, organic food, all that sort of stuff. And so I think greener capitalism is possible. I don't think capitalism and greenness are incompatible for sure, but there are various system-wide issues, huge system-wide issues that I think need to be addressed. And although American-style capitalism seems to be a bit of a worst case in some respects, you can see, a place like Sweden, for example, extremely capitalist, in many respects, some very powerful firms going around, and yet it's also extremely sustainable, incredible recycling rates, all sorts of good things happening there. So it helps. I mean, it's doable. But the US type of capitalism has, and I think more in the last 30 years than ever. I mean, it's changed in directions which are very troubling and need a reset,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dr. Jones, I know we don't have you forever. We can't thank you enough for your time on Earth Day here, sharing your new project with us. If you have time for one more question, we've got one that just came in from Matthew. What do you consider to be a family-owned business nowadays? Walmart, Coke, Ford, Lego, if you even consider them family-owned. You mentioned companies that are the most deeply responsible are private and family-owned. Can giant companies really be socially responsible?
Yeah, from a theory point of view, I think the leadership of a company and its values set the values of a company and
Yeah.
can help frame the values. So I think a giant company can be socially responsible. I mean, you gave me an interesting. So let me clarify. I don't believe all family firms are responsible or sustainable. Absolutely not.
Sure.
But a subset are, I think. And I explicitly didn't give examples of American family firms. As a matter of fact, I gave examples of Indian family firms.
Sure.
Because there you see, you take firms like the Goodrich or Tatars, you see particular ethical values or spiritual values very strong in the sort of the DNA of the family and passed on generation to generation. It's passed on as an expectation of responsibility, and that's, I think that kind of thing is very real and very very doable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Leadership matters, it turns out. Very important. Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you once again, Dr. Jones. This was a wonderful session, very thought-provoking. I know I enjoyed it, and I'm sure all of our audience did as well. If you know people who would like to check out the talk, we'll be posting it to the Rowan Center for Responsible Leadership's YouTube channel. If you faculty who are here, if you'd like to share it with your class, you can distribute it that way as well. Once again, a happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jones, and we hope to have you back on campus, maybe in person sometime as well, once your project is finished.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.